All right, so tonight we're going to talk about CSS, and some of you guys may have some experience with it. Some of you guys might have none at all. I'm going to come at it from an angle that will hopefully get both sides up to speed and give you a basic framework and understanding of what CSS is, where we use it, why we use it, and basically what you can do with it. Uh, Andrea was nice enough to print out my outline for tonight's lesson, so if it helps you guys to write stuff down, uh, go ahead, you can just write it down right next to the sections that we're going to be covering. Yeah, yeah. All right, so basically last night I went over this. I was sitting down with my wife and I was like, "Can I just read this to you?" And she's like, "Sure." So I started reading it to her and I like practically put her into a coma because she was bored out of her mind. So I tried to rework it a little bit to make it a little bit more interesting. Um, so just bear with me if it's a face melter. So let's look at our objective for tonight then, which I kind of already mentioned. We're going to look to provide a working knowledge of the cascading style sheet syntax, which is basically what CSS means. We're going to figure out who uses it, how to read and write it, how it relates to web pages, and its role in this thing called the DOM or the DOM, which stands for the Document Object Model. I'm not going to touch too much on that, but it is important for us to at least understand what the DOM is in order to figure out what the role of CSS is relative to the DOM. So to begin, what is CSS? Well, the cascading style sheet model provides a way to visually style elements on a web page. Think of it like clicking the B icon in Microsoft Word to make your text bold. We can do the same thing with web pages using CSS codes instead of clicking buttons. So a lot of you guys are familiar with Word, like that big ribbon you have with all those little design icons, make it bold, italicized, underlined, change the background color of text, the font and all that. We can do the exact same thing with CSS. And this is how we do it. So if we look at the text up here, there's really four things we can identify about it. The text reads big, hairy, audacious text. If we were to describe what that text looked like in English, we would say, well, it's centered on the page. We could say the size of it, I mean, you probably couldn't guess, but the real size of it is 36-point font. The weight of it is bold, and the color of it is green. Pretty easy stuff. And as you look at it, it's human readable, but that's actually CSS, what you're looking at right there. Those are valid CSS rules applied to that text in the center there. And to sort of illustrate that, I'm going to jump right into an example that we're going to take a look at. We see the same text here in this sample. Let me just resize some stuff to make it more visible for us. Over here on the left is our HTML, which you learned about last week with Sean. And it's pretty simple. We have a body element. Inside of it is a heading element. And that's all we have that makes up our page. In the right pane here, we have our CSS. This is considered a class definition. So a class, which I'll talk about in a bit, is basically defined within these curly braces. And as we saw back on the slide, whoops, that's for later. As we saw back on the slide, we pretty much named what those properties were. And as long as we enclose them in these curly braces here, we've essentially defined our first CSS class. So we're going to play around with this a little bit. If we think about just visually how text can be lined up, we know that it's centered, but how else can you line it up? I mean, left or right. So let's give it a shot. Change it to left, update it, and we see now that it's justified to the left. Same here with the right. Just like that. So it's pretty easy. Same thing with the font size. We'll just play around with it. We'll make it a lot smaller. This is pretty much your standard font size you'll see on a page, 12-point font. And we see the changes reflected there. Kind of still aligned to the right. If I want to keep it centered, I can do that. Pretty simple stuff. So really, we start to see already that CSS is basically, if you can describe something, there's probably a CSS property that's associated with it. That's the best way to think of it. And as a matter of fact, that's how I learned most of CSS. I mean, thankfully, there's tools out there that can sort of auto-hint properties for you if you start typing in what you think they might be. But I mostly learned CSS just from trial and error. I thought, okay, well, there's got to be a way to align text in the center. Let's try calling it this. And if it didn't work, then you try giving it a different name until eventually you find text align.
So those values don't already exist. You have to enter them manually.
Well, there are rules that are in existence. In other words, you can't just create something new. So these are all predefined. What I was getting at was that because I didn't know any of those predefined rules, I pretty much just guessed some of them and I figured them out that way. But there are resources on the internet, which I'll give you at the end of this lesson, that are like, it's basically just a big index. You can reference this web page to see all of the CSS properties that are available to set on any given element on a page. Does that answer your question?
Sure did.
Okay. So let's look at where we use CSS. It's found in web pages. It's found all over mobile applications, even though you don't really see it. It's found on blogs, which again are part of web pages, forums, which are part of web pages. Even Microsoft Word uses CSS. Microsoft Word, whenever you edit something within it, you don't really see what's going on under the hood, but there's a lot of translating that's taking place so that if you were to save your Word document as an HTML file, and you were to open up that HTML file in Notepad, you would actually see a series of CSS classes within that Microsoft uses to generate. CSS is very powerful because it's very flexible. It can be used with all different types of technologies. And as you see down there, I have an affection for Microsoft products. Internet Explorer, as Sean mentioned before, tends to go against the grain of a lot of things in many ways, especially with CSS. And part of the reason for that is because Microsoft for a long time has had proprietary holds on certain pieces of software, and their way of styling things was unique to Microsoft. And so it was very difficult for them to move forward with standards-based CSS. And what we ended up with then, even though the rest of the world moved forward in standardization with CSS, Microsoft still kind of kept their own thing. So for us as web developers, we have to be aware of both sides of the playing field, and we have to write CSS in a way that works cross-platform, whether it's a Microsoft product or not. Those days are going away. I mean, if you guys are using Windows 7 or Internet Explorer 9 or newer, we don't really have those problems anymore, but they do still exist, and I'm actually going to talk about why that exists, like the root issue for that in just a little bit. So, any questions so far? Yeah.
Do you have to actually create a web page just for the mobile?
Some people do. There are ways that you don't have to do it anymore. When mobile devices first, when handheld devices first came out with web browsers, it was very difficult to design websites for them because you had to have two separate websites basically. You had to have your regular website that you would view on a desktop computer and then another copy styled completely differently to fit the screen size of a mobile device. Nowadays, technology has advanced in such a way that web developers have access to basically a single way of designing, and CSS helps out with that tremendously, but a single way of designing so that no matter what screen size you're viewing something on, CSS will allow it to scale down appropriately to fit that screen resolution. So to answer your question, yes and no. It depends on whether or not you're intelligent enough to know about those new technologies to be able to make your life easier for CSS and for web development. So.
Is there a separate CSS for Android versus like iOS?
No, CSS is it's a standard language. What I was talking about before with Microsoft being a little bit different, there are some Microsoft-specific CSS properties, which I won't really get into. It's something you'll learn about as needed. But CSS itself is a standard for styling elements on a web page, and it's pretty much across the board. You won't find really any differences whether you're doing it for a web page on the internet or for an application for Android development or for your iOS, CSS is CSS across the board. That's one of the reasons why we should know about it, actually. It's widely used, it's commonly encountered on the web, and it's easy to learn, as we've already seen. So CSS, in order to understand it, we need to have a little bit of background on something called the document object model. It's just a fancy name, guys. You don't have to get confused by it. I just call it the DOM. The DOM is basically a tree of HTML elements. Again, Sean covered this stuff last week. We have here a body element or a body tag, and we see it has a closing tag at the bottom of it, and inside of it we have our heading and we have our sample paragraph. So we have 3 tags on the page, a body, a heading, and a paragraph. The DOM is representative of these in that the document object model basically is a way in which we organize these tags in a structured format. So for example, it would make no sense for me, according to the HTML set of the DOM, to put a heading outside of the body, because the body is what defines our entire page content. I can put a heading outside of there, but according to the rules of the DOM and HTML, I shouldn't do it. So the DOM is just basically a guideline or a model for how we program this stuff, how we lay out all these little codes. And you might hear it from time to time. That's why I bring it up. And it's also important to know it because it really speaks volumes about this concept of a tree, and I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute. What's important to realize is that every element is styled with CSS. So we have our web page here, and I think I have a code example. I'm getting too far ahead. I had a code example. I don't have it here to show you what this looks like on a page. But basically, if I had no CSS at all applied to any of these elements, you would just see a generic heading. It would say heading in big black text. And below that, you would see just the word sample paragraph content, period. CSS, with it, as you guys have already seen, we can take and make that a little bit more visually impressive. So let's move forward and explain what I mean by that. So HTML is built on the DOM, and elements and tags comprise HTML. Again, Sean talked about that last week. CSS is applied to these elements. So think about it like hairless cats. Without that fur, they're ugly. Now, the fur, that's the CSS part. So pretty easy stuff. So we're going to look at now the concept of a style sheet. We've covered the HTML, we've covered the DOM. Let's now go back and focus on CSS. So a style sheet is basically a collection of rules, one rule being this down here on the left side. It's a collection of these rules applied to one or more elements on a page that produces a visual effect. Now at this point, my wife finally started to pay attention, because I pretty much melted her face off with all the other stuff before now. So on the left side, we have our CSS rule. On the right side, we have what that is doing. So here's our HTML down here. We have a heading, a simple heading. And on the left side, we have our CSS rule applied to it. The only thing we're doing is giving it the color blue. So we can figure out CSS syntax pretty easily. H1 refers to the type of element we want to affect, and inside of the curly braces are all the things we want to do to that element. So we're going to expand on that a little bit. We're going to talk about the tree again. This is extremely important with CSS, understanding this idea of parents, children, and siblings. Because with CSS, we have to target these elements, and we need a way to do it. And in order to do it, one way to do it is to understand parent-child relationships. So let's look at this HTML code right here. We have, again, a body, we have a heading, and we have a paragraph. The body in this example is our parent element. Inside of it, we have a heading, which is a child of the body. Anything inside of the body is its child. Below the heading, but outside of its closing tag, is a paragraph. That paragraph, then, is also a child of the body, but a sibling to the heading. And it's pretty easy stuff. We go one level deeper down the tree, and we see a B element, which stands for bold, and an A element, which stands for anchor. That's how we create links. These are both children of the paragraph, but they're siblings to each other. That makes sense, right? Okay. Sorry, I didn't even realize that. Okay, so you guys are probably going to hear HTML and CSS referred to in a number of different ways. It's kind of confusing. All of those things that we looked at back here, whoops, these tags with this less than and greater than symbols, those are called carets, and inside of it is the name of the particular tag that you want to create, and that translates to a type of element on the page. You're going to hear them referred to as different names. Some people call them elements, some people call them nodes. Basically means a point on the tree branch. Don't really need to remember that stuff. It's just if you hear about it, don't be confused. They have different names depending on the context in which you're speaking about them. All you need to know is that every web page must have 4 basic elements. They are a root element, a head element, a title element, and a body element. So what does that look like as a full page? Well, here it is. I just changed the colors for you on those tags so that you could visually see it a little bit better. Now, the reason why I was spending a lot of time on this whole idea of parent-child relationships is because there's something in CSS called global rules, and there's something called specificity. Don't even remember those names. Just forget about it unless you have a good memory. I got interviewed for a job before I worked here, and one of the guys who interviewed me said, he was like a CSS guru. He said, what can you tell me about specificity? I just gave him a blank stare. I had no idea what he was talking about. I've used specificity for as long as I've been a CSS programmer, but I had no idea that that's what it was called. So because I just learned it, I'm sharing it with you guys. But I'll explain what it is. So we look at 2 CSS classes here. The first one is an H1 class. The second one is something that we haven't seen yet. It says body H1. Here's our code that it's going to be applied to. So why will the heading text be blue? Now, of course, the answer is down there because specificity rules, but can anybody, based on what you see in these 2 classes, explain why that text will be blue? And this all goes back to the parent-child relationship thing that I was talking about. Right, the second one's more specific. Even though this is a valid class that says, hey, make every single heading have red text, well, in this example, we have a heading inside of a body. And because the heading is a child to the body, this rule is more specific, and so the text will be blue. So we're going to take a look at that as an example. All right, so here it is in like a live environment. We can change this to anything that we want, and it'll still be blue. But let's say, for example, I remove this. Now our text becomes purple, because there is no more of a specific rule to be applied to it. Now let's sort of mix them up a little bit. This will help you understand about the importance of omitting certain properties. Let me just change this real quick. Okay. So let's say, for example, in this first class definition, I have a heading, and I want it to be underlined. I'll just give you the code for that. It's called text decoration, underline. Now, before I update it, what do you guys think is going to happen? Is my heading going to be underlined or not? Okay, and why? Yes, because there's nothing to override it. So it's going to inherit its way back up the tree or the style sheet until it finds something that matches it. Likewise here, I'm sorry, it's already bold. That's something I'm going to talk about. Actually, I might as well address it now. Okay, so I just applied a font weight of bold to this heading, but nothing happened. That's because it was already bold. The reason why it's already bold is because if I were to remove all of this CSS, just leave it as is, we still see that there's a style applied to it. We don't know where it's coming from, but there's a style applied to it. That's because every single browser has a default style sheet. Even if you don't see it, it has a default style sheet. So this is the reason, this is the root reason why you see differences in browsers, because every browser interprets the styles differently based on what their defaults are. So for example, I'm viewing this in Chrome right now, we can see that there's a bit of a margin above this heading. That margin in Chrome is actually I don't remember which way it goes, but in Chrome, this margin is maybe a few pixels greater from the top than it would be in Internet Explorer. So that's one reason why you see, if you're viewing a site in Chrome, it looks great. You view it in Internet Explorer, it looks like crap. It's because default style sheets are different. And that explains why, even though I didn't have a font weight applied, it was still bold. It's because the default is for it to be bold. That's good enough. All right, so going back, any questions? Okay. Okay, so we understand then that the H1 element, or I'm sorry, the H1 class and the body H1 class are not the same, because H1 applies to every H1 on the page, but body H1 applies to every H1 inside the body. Now, I'm going to point out real quick that these two things we're seeing here, H1 and body H1, I said that by using curly braces after them and putting your properties inside, you're defining what's called a class. But the actual naming convention is called a selector. The reason why it's called a selector is because you're telling in code basically how to find an element on a page. So this is the way in which you're selecting it. Give me every H1. Give me every H1 that is a child of the body. So those are actually called selectors. And the bottom part you already know there. Now there is one other way to sort of override that parent-child relationship that we're talking about, and that's using a special keyword called important, which is preceded by an exclamation point. So we know that specificity can override, but there's also something called an explicit override using the important keyword. So we take the same two classes that we've already defined in the last example, and in this case, in the first class, the H1, using the H1 selector, we put after the color this important keyword. And what will happen is the text will be red. Because even though there's a more specific rule with the body H1 selector, the important keyword takes precedence. That's important to know for, yeah, what's up?
So why would you even have the body H1 if the red is going to override it?
That's a good point. And I was going to get to that, but I'll talk about it a bit now. Why would we do this? Well, it wouldn't make so much sense to do it with that top class first and that next class second. It would make more sense to flip it. The reason why it would make more sense to flip it is because, let's say, for example, you download a WordPress theme, okay, for your blog, and you install it, and you have all these great styles and stuff that are already set up and applied to your pages, but you don't know where those styles are coming from, or you can't really find them in all that code because there's thousands of lines of it, and even if you search for it, you can't really find it. But you know that you want to change the text from yellow to red. So what you can do is you just find where you want to do that in your post, and you create a new style sheet, and in it you put this override keyword in there, and that will ensure that that element receives your color instead of the color that shipped with the theme that you downloaded. Okay. And there's also other instances in which we would use that, but that's probably the most prevalent example you'll find. And also, Scott, getting to your question about that, there's a whole nother facet of where the important keyword can be used. So this leads us into something about CSS called inline styles. Now, the whole time so far we've been talking about class definitions, which we've seen before right here. Anything surrounded in the curly braces is a class definition. An inline style, I shouldn't say you haven't seen before, because you marketing guys might have dealt with that quite a bit. Like if you're blogging, anybody who blogs, you might have dealt with inline styling a lot. An inline style is basically the exact same thing as what's above, except it goes as an attribute inside of the element itself and only affects that element. Does that make sense? So in this case, what color will the H1 text be? Yeah, it'll be blue. So inline styles can override class definitions. So there's a lot of overrides going on and things that take precedence, and that's why I spent a lot of time talking to you guys about this, even as boring as it may be. I didn't learn CSS this way first, and it like drove me nuts because I couldn't understand why the stuff I was trying to do that I thought would work didn't work. So that's why I spent a lot of time on this with you now. Now, with class definitions versus inline style sheets, why can they go in two different places? Well, there's a few things you have to consider. There's actually four things you have to consider. The first is for purposes of structure. When you talk about a site as complex and as large as our site, VoIP Supply, if you just use inline styles, that is for every single heading you have on a web page, you start throwing these things in there, sooner or later you're going to miss one. And if you ever want to change that color, you have to go back and change every single style attribute for every single heading on your website. You know, we talk about hundreds of thousands of products, all of them have one of these on their pages. You have to go back and do that for every single one. You don't want that. So for the purposes of structure, a more formal class definition is appropriate because it can apply with a single statement to every single H1 on every single page. Another thing you have to consider is reuse. You know, how often is this going to be used? If you only have this one little link at the bottom of a page that only appears on that page, do you really need to create a whole class for it in a special separate style sheet? If not, then you might want to apply it inline just to that element. You also got to consider convenience. Are you looking for a quick fix, or is this a well laid out plan? And access limitations is the last one. This happens with bloggers a lot who use WordPress. A lot of you guys might not know how to change the code in your blog, or you might be limited into what types of codes you can use when you're making a post. So for access limitations, you would find yourself using inline styles because that's all you can reach at that point. I don't even know what my example is here. Oh, okay, just a bunch of different headings here. In this example, we see that I've applied a formal class definition. Every H1 is going to be the color red, but the reason why the first one is blue is because I have an inline style only on that heading. So that's what I was talking about. What is your use case? You know, if every H1 on your page you want to look the same, you want them all to be red, then make a formal class definition. But if you have like an About Us page and you just happen to want that one heading blue, maybe an inline style works. Now, something that I wish Garrett was here for that he might be able to explain is that some search engines actually penalize you for using inline styles. Just be aware of that. I don't fully know the reasoning behind it. I'm not a big SEO guy, but it just might be something for you to research if you ever do get to it. Yeah, Dicey's falling asleep over there. It's all good, man. All right, so we're gonna start testing you guys, or I'm gonna start testing you guys, and then we're gonna basically just have some activities with this. So we're gonna review. CSS supplies styles like colors and fonts to elements on a page. It works by targeting specific elements. So therefore, we can target a heading just like that. There's your syntax. H1, curly brace, the property, colon, the value, semicolon, curly brace. That is your class definition. All right, so in this activity, which is called Name That Style, all I want you guys to do is call out the CSS properties used to style the elements on the page. You might remember some of the properties from this lesson, but you won't know all of them. The point is to guess what the property might be named that is being applied. So here's our code up at the top. We have a heading, Hello World, and we see how it's applied on a web page. That's what it looks like as your finished product. And there's 3 styles applied to it. So looking at it, what can you tell me about it? Describe it. Okay. So the color's red. Font weight's bold. It could be, yeah, but that you're right. But in this example, that's not the one. Yeah, there you go. The font size, 36 point. Very good. So really easy stuff. All you gotta do is look at it. Or if you're working backwards, which is how you always work with CSS, you don't know what the finished product looks like on the web page. You just envision it in your head based on what you visualize in your head or draw it on paper. You translate that to CSS. Color red, font weight bold, font size 36 point. All All right, so we're going to turn that into real CSS code now, which we haven't formally looked at. I keep talking about these class definitions. Your question might be, well, where do they go? Where do they go on the web page? They have to go inside of a special element called style. And here it has an attribute that defines its type. So to give you an example of that, let me go back a couple steps here. Get to this page. This site that I'm using right now to show this demonstration allows me to break up all the various parts. It allows me to separate my HTML from my CSS. You won't typically have that if you're writing your own code. It isn't always broken up like this. So as I was talking about, whoops, let me get back to this. As I was talking about turning that into real CSS code, this is how we do it. I'll just use this as my example. I'm going to cut this out of here, and we're going to put it along with the HTML. Now nowadays you don't have to put that type attribute in there. Most browsers are smart enough to know that you're going to put CSS in there, but the reason why traditionally you would define a type is because there may be different types of style elements. In this case, we're going to put CSS inside of it, so if you can define the type, go for it. Now this is a formal class definition inside of a style element. If I run it, it's going to give me the exact same thing. Nothing's changed. Now we see here two or both types of classes illustrated. We have a formal class definition inside of a style element, and we have an inline style at the same time. So we see that CSS is like very portable. It can go in many different places. All right, so the next activity, same idea. This one might not be as familiar though. Okay, here's our HTML. We have an article element and a paragraph inside of it. So I'll give you a hint. One style is applied to the article element, and two are applied to the paragraph element. I've already set up our classes. So let's look at the article class. What? Yes, background color. Very good, blue. And the paragraph? It's white and underlined. I'm sorry, I didn't hear if you said. Did you say center? Yeah. I'm sorry. Because this is not a real web page, I just kind of like dragged these things onto it. So I just happened to put it in the center. That probably threw you off, but technically if this was a web page, I would also have to make a CSS property called text align centered. So you're right, Andrea. And again, turning that into real CSS code, basically just cut out what we wrote here, and we enclose it inside of this style element, and that gives us our style sheet. Whatever. I don't care. No. I was just having fun on the screen.
But did you tell him why you're sleeping so he doesn't think it's boring?
No, I'm telling you, man, my wife was falling asleep, so it's okay.
No, it's seriously not you. Right?
I don't know if you follow.
He lost last night. He got drunk, cried.
Jeez.
And he's hungover today, that's why. It's not,
Ouch.
it doesn't interfere.
Sorry, bro.
All but the crying.
Bear with
Yeah,
me.
you did cry.
6:40. We're almost out of here, man. We're actually making good
No,
time.
it's seriously not you, though.
We might be able to make your game.
We are going to make a game. That's not an option.
Oh, no. I'd like that.
Okay.
Oh my God.
The brawl ensues. All right, so at the same time of learning CSS, you might have picked up some HTML. And we look here. We have our largest heading. We've learned that if you didn't know it already. An article container, paragraph. Just like CSS having an index of all these different properties that you can apply to an element, HTML also has its own index of all the different types of elements that are available to use on a web page. Technically speaking, you could, with a modern browser, name an element anything you want. You know, if a dog element didn't exist, I could just write it and it will still come out on the page as an element. It wouldn't have anything to do with a dog, but dog is just the name that I'm giving to that element. That illustrates the power of HTML and the DOM itself. So going back to that real quick, the DOM, as I said, is just a model for how we structure information in a tree or on a page. HTML is a subset of the DOM, which specifically applies to web pages. XML, if you guys are familiar with that, is also part of the DOM, and it works in the same way as HTML. It's just a different set of tags that you can use with XML versus HTML. And CSS, going back to that now, you guys have learned background color, color, font weight, font size, text decoration. Yeah.
Are each of the dual or triple word strings separated by hyphens? Is that like the rule?
Yeah, actually with CSS, you will never see a property with an underscore. You'll never see a property with a space. There can't be spaces, there can't be underscores, and it cannot start with a number. So CSS properties will always be hyphenated if it's a multi-word thing. Very rarely, if you're looking at somebody else's code, you might see some special ones that are prefixed with a dash or a hyphen. Those generally mean that they're like beta properties that are scheduled for release as a standard property in a future version of CSS. So if you see those, you don't want to mess with them too much unless you really know what you're doing. But right, just as you said, Andrea, they're all really called sanitized with a hyphen. All right, so next activity is called Float Your Boat. In this activity, we're going to learn that CSS can also apply to images on a web page, which we haven't dealt with yet. The page given in this activity is poorly laid out. We want it to read like a news article, but can't get it to look right. So your job is to correct its layout by adding properties to the style sheet. So here we have this great news article, but it doesn't look that great. And there's our HTML on the left. Structurally, we just have an image element which points to our picture. Right underneath it, we have a paragraph, another paragraph, and a third paragraph. So this is exactly how it renders on the page. So imagine that inside of this box is what you're looking at in Google Chrome, except the background color is gray. We have not defined any styles yet. We have not made any class definitions yet. But that's what we're going to do in order to make this image sort of flow with the text. Just like you would do in Microsoft Word, you guys drop in an image and then you can choose, if you like double click on the image, you can set floating on it, or wrapping is what I think they call it in Microsoft Word. You can set it so that the text wraps around the image and then it reads more like a magazine. So that's what we're going to do in this example. Now we're going to introduce a new thing in this example too. This is a new concept about CSS. There's basically two types of elements in HTML. If we look at our code, we have two right here. We have an image element and a paragraph element. Those are the only two we're using in this example. So paragraph elements are what are called block level elements, and image elements are what are called inline level elements. So we're going to look at the difference between the two to figure out how we can use CSS to blend them visually. So a block level element, like a paragraph, and in this case like a heading, they expand as far as they can from left to right on a page. So even though your text, even though your heading text stops here, the actual heading element itself is block level. So its width is going to expand as far to the right as it can on the page. Same thing with a paragraph element. So basically what that means is it leaves no room for images to wrap around the text. But there is a way around that. Now let's look at inline level elements. As you might have guessed, inline level elements only take up the space needed on the page. So if I have two image elements, a random link, and another image element in my HTML code, if the space on the page permits, they're all going to line up one after the other. So inline level elements only take up the horizontal space needed on the page. So how do we combine these two types of elements in a visually appealing way? The answer is with something called floats. Any element can be floated. Basically, floating pulls an element left or right, and floating breaks an element of its natural flow. Floating also wraps surrounding elements around itself. So if I, in this example, float that image, I'm going to cause everything around it to flow nicely around it. So I don't know why Google, this Google presentation app does this. It doesn't really look like this when I was designing it, but every time I present it and preview it, it kind of shifts the text. So just pretend that that's beautiful. All right, so we have our starting place right here, and we have our finished product. So our goal is to get from here to here. How do we do that? Well, the answer is with floating, and we're going to float the image to the right. So floating causes surrounding elements to wrap around the image. Floating right means that surrounding elements will wrap the left side of it. Let's see how it works. So here we have the same HTML code. I just cut it off for the sake of visibility, or almost the same HTML code. And a CSS style sheet that we've now populated with information. Here we've selected every image element on the page, and we've told it to float to the right. So this is our finished product here on the right side. What I've done is I've showed you, you don't actually see these borders on the page. These are invisible borders. I'm just showing them to you to illustrate how floating works. We see that these two paragraphs are still block level. That hasn't changed. We know that because their borders still go end to end. But by floating an image, what we're doing is we're telling it to, in this case, go all the way to the right, but cause anything else around it to flow around it. So the block level remains the same, but the text inside of it flows around the image. So that's it. Floats are kind of hard to understand and work with. They can get very confusing. In fact, there's still some bugs to this day about using floats, and there's all sorts of techniques to get around that. I'm not really going to talk about that today. It's not really important because most of the stuff that you'll be working with, if at all, can be cured or understood with simple floating, like to the left or to the right. Any questions on floats? Yeah, absolutely. In this example, I mean, it's already padded a bit. If we were to look at this on a real web page, actually, I could show it to you. Just get you to an example. I'm going to put an image in here real quick. Okay, so we have a dummy image in here, and if I were to float it, so we're going to make a class definition, just like we've seen. We're going to float it to the right. Okay, so we see that that works as expected. Let me make these a little bit longer, though, Courtney, so we can really illustrate that. I guess there must be some... Oh, it's because of the word breaking. Okay, so here we see that S in us pretty much goes right up to the image. That's still pretty visually ugly. So what we can do is add, what I would do is add margin or padding to the image element itself. And in this case, it's pretty simple. I mean, these are new CSS properties, but we just named them margin. So we can add a margin to it of, let's just say 10 pixels. The unit for that is px. And we see how that's applied margin. What you may not have realized is that we applied margin all the way around the image. You don't always want that. CSS is convenient enough to where things like margin and padding also have sister properties. In this case, margin left still applies that 10 pixel margin, but only to the left side of the image. And that is actually pretty powerful because if you want the margin left to be 10 pixels, but from the top you want it to be 25 pixels, you can also do that. You may also see, just to throw this in there, you may also see a combination of top right, bottom left in a single margin property, and that would look like this. That's also valid CSS. The order of these arguments here goes from top to left in clockwise order. So it would be top, right, bottom, left. That's pretty much standard with any CSS property that has to do with borders and margins and padding. It's going to go in it's going to go clockwise from top to left. Good question, though, Courtney. Anybody got any questions about that?
Are you going to go on to how you can do it vertically also?
What do you mean by vertically?
Like if you don't want the image at the top, you want it like halfway down.
Oh yeah, actually, great question. Floating. If I go back to, okay, if I go back to the example here, look at our actual HTML code. We have the image element first, followed by 2 paragraphs. When we float that image, it's going to float as far as it can to the right, based on where it is in the code. So by floating it to the right, it's going to line up with the next block level element's top baseline. That's why it'll be there. If we wanted this image to be lined up with this paragraph, so this would, flow from left to right, but the image would start to break here, then we would put that image tag in between the two.
Can you break up the paragraph?
Yeah.
So say like successfully floated image, search for there the image.
Successfully floated. Yeah, that would look a little bit different though. I'll see if I can write that up for you real quick. So we create our paragraph. Okay. If I were to put the image in there though, it wouldn't be structured the same way, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's make that a little bit. Let's put some more text in there. Still need some more. Let's make that a little bit bigger. A little bit bigger. Okay, so what you're asking, Andrea, is, let's say we wanted to put this image like just to the right of the word right. In order to do that, you'd have to structure it a little bit differently. You couldn't simply put the image inside of it, nor could you put the image above outside of it. What you'd have to do is break up the paragraph into essentially 2 paragraphs or 2 elements. And put it there. But it would still break the flow of things. If you actually wanted, and the reason why it breaks the flow of things is because these are block level elements which go as far from left to right as they can, and because our image tag does not appear until below the first paragraph, which is block level, it's going to retain this invisible block and then fall below it. In order to have it in between, you have to use technically a different type of element. This one I'm going to just call span. And we actually don't even have to float that. I'll make it smaller to illustrate the example. So the reason why this works is because these 3 elements here, span, image, span, are all inline level, and that's why in the example I told you that inline level elements will flow one after the other in succession across the page until there's no more room, then it breaks the next line. Let's go back to that. So in that case, we would use all inline level elements to perform that. Another thing that might be useful to you guys while we're looking at this, you see how like the text is at the bottom of the image? For me as a designer, sometimes that's kind of annoying. So just as a tip, to the image, you can apply a property called vertical align and set that to be middle. And what that does is it causes the really like the baseline of measurement for the image to not be at the bottom, which it is by default, but instead be at the center. That's how you line up the text. Okay, so we've learned about a static image, which is the image element, and we've learned about floating. And that's pretty much it. I do have some more examples that we can look at if you guys aren't going to the game.
How
Some good places to read that I read all the time. CSStricks.com will show you some really sweet things you can do with CSS. And another one is Quirks Mode. Quirks Mode is, I guess it's more of an advanced place to go if you really get into CSS. Quirks Mode, the guy who runs that, he does a really good job of showing you the differences between browsers and how CSS looks in each browser so that you could be prepared for what might screw up in one browser versus the other. So, does anybody have any questions? Ask me anything. Sean?
Do you want to quickly touch on the idea of external style sheets versus declarations right inside of the HTML, or do you want to get that later?
You mean like as opposed to referencing an external sheet at a remote location?
A lot of times you don't necessarily want to include all your styles right within the HTML, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Let's look at an example here. Okay, so let's say this page is like, I don't know, 100,000 words in length. It's a huge article. You have all sorts of different layout elements on it. And when you look at the HTML code, it's just massive. Like this is, several lines, but in the example I just described, this would be hundreds of thousands of lines. And if you were to go in and edit that, sometimes it would just be ridiculous to look at. It would just make you sick. So what helps for us as designers is to separate our CSS from our HTML. And we can do that by cutting out our CSS and putting it into a separate location, into a separate file. And that would be what's called an external style sheet. Now, the way we get it into the page is basically the same as we've done. We still use this style element here, except we add to it another attribute. And that attribute is, oh, crap. I'm telling you guys wrong information. No, we don't use a style element. We use a different type of element called link. And the type here can still be called text CSS. And in order to point to a remote location, we use an attribute called href. And this would be the actual value in here would point to your style sheet. So you have a style sheet at mysite.com called mystyle.css. Let's just say, for example, that this code was inside of that style sheet. So if you were to launch this in your web browser, what would happen is all of this would appear on the page, but then immediately at the same time, this element would tell the browser to go look at this remote location, grab that file, and pull it in as your style sheet. It would basically do the exact same thing. Well, what would happen is, let's say I had this. Yeah, if I had, let's say I had this style sheet here, okay? Basically, I have two style sheets. We have the first one here, and then we have one pulled in remotely here. And let's say the one remote contains this. Let's just say for the purpose of example, it contains this, except we're going to change that to blue. Okay? First, because it would be an order of execution, this style sheet would be applied to the whole page. But then as soon as this one gets loaded in from the remote location, anything in here that would match the same element would override this one. Okay? If we took this and we put it below that element, then it would just work and vice versa. This would get loaded in first, then anything that happens here would override whatever's in here. Okay?
So the CSS style sheet is like the HTML sheet from last week? It's just like stored locally?
Yeah, a style sheet, typically you'll see style sheets in a separate file called a .css file, and it would look just like what's in the right pane here. So yeah, it's just another file that would complement your HTML file. So,
Save as?
well, if you were doing it in Notepad, you would write your CSS just like we did here. You go to File, Save As, and as the file type, choose All Files. And then for the name of your file, you would give it a name.css. And that would, losing my voice, and that would do it. Okay. Any other questions? You guys are dead?
Is that, if you save it as a .css, does that mean that somebody can't, like, steal your text? They just go to look at the elements online?
Well, they could still see it because they still see this. Like they could see that in your HTML code and they could see that it points to that file. All they got to do is copy that and paste it into their browser, and they'd be able to see all of your CSS. But CSS is not really, since that file can't be edited by putting it into your browser, it's not going to do any harm. They're just going to see how you styled your site, which I do all the time actually. Like if I go to if I have a design drawn for a website and I start to lay it out in HTML and CSS, and the way I want to style my menu was inspired by something someone did on another site, I'll go to their site, look at the source code. If they have style sheets referenced in there, I'll download those style sheets, study them, see how they did it, and then I'll mimic that, or I'll change it as I see fit. Just real quick, I'm going to show you more of a full HTML page. Sort of playing on what Sean did last week with dogs. So I basically set up a blog, and this is my layout. The HTML is kind of tough to see because this is what I mean. Like as you get beyond a few lines of code, stuff gets really hard to read. Try to expand this as much as I can. We have our 4 basic elements of a web page: HTML, head, title, and the body. Our body is where all of our content goes, and that's what you see rendered over here on the right. Without any CSS at all, I'll show you what that page looks like. Kind of looks like one of Sean's pages from last week. Very generic. One of the important things to notice is that this image that's in here is huge. With CSS, you can do what's called create responsiveness based on the viewing area that's available to you. And Andrea, this touches on what you were asking about earlier. Do you have to design 2 different sites or 2 different layouts depending on what device you're looking at from? With CSS, you don't have to do that anymore. That image without the style sheet, like I said, was huge, just like that. It even goes beyond our viewing area. But with CSS, we can take that image, or we can select that image in CSS. In this case, it's called logo. I'll explain that. We can select that image with CSS. Say we want the width to be 100% and the height to be automatic. What that means is the image will stretch as far as it can in the viewing area from left to right, and the height will automatically and proportionately scale with whatever width that fits to. If we didn't have that, it would still be huge. Likewise, if we got rid of the height, oh well, in that case it works. But again, on some browsers it won't work. If you don't specify an automatic height, it won't necessarily automatically scale back with whatever the width becomes.
Why is there a period in front of
Yes, great question. Great question. I didn't talk about this, mostly because it took an hour to talk about all the other stuff. Let me go back to the presentation.
I won't ask any more questions before I do that because I'm sorry.
Yeah, if anyone has to go for the game, get out of here. Let me go back to that real quick. Okay, you know how we talked about these being selectors? So we target our heading by making sure we only get every heading within the body. This is a selector, and it's called an element level selector. Hey, get some water, man. All right, I'll try to get through this.
Okay,
You can? Thank you.
I know all that stuff.
That's their way out. So these are called element level selectors. Element level basically means it's going to choose whatever HTML element is on the page. But CSS is extremely powerful, And this is gonna open up a whole another level for you. Let me find one. Okay, the body here. This is easy. We're selecting the body element in our code, which is here in HTML, and we're going to do this stuff to it. But let's say in the case of this image here, I only want that image to scale with the viewport, not every image. So far in our examples, we've seen classes that select every image. But let's say I only want this image and I don't want to use an inline style. What I can do is tag it with a special name called a class name. So let's go to our image in the code. We have our source, which points to where the image is, and we have another attribute called class. Thank you. Okay, in this case, class is set to logo. That means in my style sheet, I can select only that image using its specified class name. Class names are always prefixed with a dot. Okay? And that's how I target it. Did that answer your question? There is another selector. You see, I've used class level selectors a lot. See all these dots? That basically means in my code, I've tagged specific elements with these class names. That's how I can target them in my CSS. There is another one that's not in here, which I'll show you real quick. Let's say this is no longer dot logo. Say it's pound logo. If I refresh this, that image no longer receives it because, well, as far as that image is concerned in CSS, it has no idea that I want this to apply to this image. That's because this hash mark here denotes a different type of selection. That's an ID selector. If I give this image element an ID of logo, now it selects it. So there's three basic types of selectors. There's element level, which is the actual HTML tag that you're targeting. There's class level, which is always preceded by a dot and tagged with this class attribute. And there's ID level selection, which is preceded by a hash mark or a pound sign and tagged with an ID in the element. The thing that's extremely powerful about CSS is that you can combine these things. Let's say, for example, I want to select this dog bread inside of that article there. Let's find it in our code. See, I've already tagged it floated image, and I've defined it here. That was easy enough. Let's say for some reason I couldn't do that or I didn't want to do that. Well, that class is no longer applied to it. Let's say I want to target it a different way. How else can I target it? I can give it an ID. I can call it dog, pound dog, and as long as I have an ID set, it's going to work. If I can't tag it with a class and I can't tag it with an ID because of some conflict with CSS elsewhere, I can also get to it by navigating the tree of parent-child relationships. I can do that like this. We know that it's an image. It has no ID or class applied to it. I know that it's inside the body. I also know that it's inside of a section element. So this is what I do. Body section image. And that class is still applied to it. So we can target it based on where it is in the tree. I'm not going to get any more advanced stuff. You can actually go deeper than that with CSS, but there's basically all different ways you can target an element. So that's about all I got for you guys. Thank you. I'll send this out to you guys so you can look over the present. Actually, you're going to get it as a link to a screencast, so you can hear everything I just said, and you'll get to watch everything we did here as well. So just let me stop that.